Hello, Vikings, and thank you, Dr. Lasambe, for asking for some 9/11 reflections. I remember that day vividly, as I'm sure most of my colleagues have said the exact same thing. I was at home with my son, Jack. He had just turned 2 years old, and I had taken a leave of absence from teaching at Worthington Kilbourne. I had the Today Show on in the background while I was cleaning up breakfast dishes, and Jack was playing on the floor with his trains, Thomas the Tank Engine, to be quite specific. And they broke into the Today Show and they showed the plane hitting the tower, and all I could think of was, oh my gosh, the pilot had a heart attack. How horrific. I felt so much sadness. Because certainly it was an accident. It was a beautiful day, right? Nothing could have possibly been happening other than just a horrific accident. And then the second plane hit. You knew it wasn't an accident. I'm choking up thinking about this. I was terrified. I have a brand new baby. I know he's 2, but he's a baby. And what kind of a world have I brought him into? And are we going to war? What does this mean? I was absolutely terrified. And I knew my mother would be terrified too, so I didn't call my mom. I called my grandma. My grandma was 91 years old at the time. And she said, honey, when your mom was 2, they bombed Pearl Harbor. When you were 2, Kennedy was killed. She said, this is a horrific thing. We don't know anything yet, but I promise you that love and compassion win over hate and fear every single time. I will never forget those words. They were the words that helped me go on and helped me believe that I hadn't brought my son into a horrible world and that we were going to get through this and it was going to be okay. And I remember in the hours following that, I ran to the grocery store because I was terrified. But yet everybody was so kind and everybody was so compassionate and everybody was like, are you okay? Are your family members okay? Did you know anybody in the crash? And people were opening doors for each other. And there was just this peace of knowing that we were all humans experiencing this tragedy together and that we were going to get through it together. And that's what I always need to believe in, that we are here for each other and we will uphold each other and we will take care of each other in any circumstance, no matter what.
Good morning, everyone. Looking back on September the 11th, 2001, I had just begun my first year of teaching. About 2 weeks prior, I had boarded an airplane from Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, and flew to Cairo, Egypt, where I would begin my first year of 10 years teaching internationally. And after a day of school, I had taught my classes and then had come home and gone to a diving class. I was learning to scuba dive, and while at that class, we were informed that we should turn on the TV and check it out, CNN, and we witnessed the second airplane hitting the second tower and watching both towers fall at that time. And I was surrounded by colleagues who were from the United States, and so to witness with fresh eyes those who were from there and had recently come to the country, also some of my colleagues who had originally come from the New York area, that they were expressing concern for family and friends who were in the midst of that. And so I got to see this situation from a unique perspective within the Middle East. The school was closed on September the 12th out of concern for our safety, and just to assess the situation, we learned soon after that a number of those who hijacked the plane were of Egyptian descent. And so there were concerns about how this would play out within the country. And so also I was receiving emails from home just to try and get on an airplane, the first airplane back to Canada, where it might be safer, but probably getting on an airplane was not something I was about to do. And in the weeks that followed, it was wonderful to be around Americans, expats from other countries, as well as Egyptians who expressed genuine concern about what had happened. Those who shared their condolences or just their genuine thoughts, whether it be my colleagues or people in local businesses, taxi drivers, in light of the news. And it was an interesting way to see how a global community would respond to a situation like this. And in the 6 years that I had lived there, I really got a sense of how much people were able to live together in a community with mutual respect, showing empathy for one another, and that genuine concern in situations like that. And I feel like we're in a similar situation right now. We haven't seen it all play out, but with COVID-19 and how we are reaching out to one another and taking steps to make sure that we all stay safe and respecting the perspectives of others, and just supporting one another as we go through these challenging times. That the human spirit is incredible, and I'm confident that as we have rebounded from those terrible times, and it's shaped the way we operate, the way we travel among countries, that I know that this will probably also shape us. And so how we respond to that situation and how we come together is going to be an exciting story that we get to all write together. Have a great day, everyone.
Good morning, everyone. On September 11th, I was here at Academy, and I have a recollection of later, not much later in the day, but later in the day after school had stopped and we'd been watching footage. We saw the towers go down on television. It was very powerful, and it was very emotional, and I wanted to see my son. Wow. Okay. Sorry, I didn't expect that reaction, but I wanted to see my son. He was a second grader here at Academy, and so I could, and I didn't have any responsibilities. So I walked out of the upper school, and I walked down to the lower school, and I walked through those glass doors to the left of the theater. And it was quiet and calm compared to the relative chaos of the upper school, of people walking from classrooms to classrooms looking for the best place to watch the news, and there was just noise and concern and tears in the upper school. And I walked into the lower school and it was quiet. There was some sounds of school going on. And I realized they didn't know that lower school teachers don't have the same kind of access to time and to media, and they didn't know. So I walked to my son's second grade classroom, and I walked in. I was friends with the teachers, Mrs. Abbott and her assistant, Mrs. Barsati, and I asked Mrs. Abbott if I could talk to her in the hallway for a second, and said, I just wanted to know if I could see Alex for a minute. She's like, of course. And she said, what's wrong? What's going on? And then I told her. Now I don't remember the timeline. I wish I did. I'm sure I could look this up. I don't remember exactly the timeline, but I believe that this was after the second tower went down, and I think it was after the plane had hit the Pentagon, but before Flight 93 had been taken down by the passengers in Flight 93, which is a story you should know if you don't. So there was another plane on the way to Washington at the time that I walked down there, and the words that I used, I'll never forget them, and I regret them. The words that I used were the words that I saw on television, which was, "We're under attack. The United States is under attack." And I told her about the buildings that had been hit, and I said, "And there's another plane on the way to Washington, D.C." And her face, and it was only. Oh, Lasambe makes fun of me for crying all the time. God, jeez. And then he does this. I think this whole project was to get me to cry. But I'm just going to go ahead. And I remembered that her husband is a Secret Service agent and was assigned to the White House. So I basically just told this young friend of mine that her husband was in danger, and I didn't do it very delicately. And I tried to reassure her, and she was upset. And I told her to go make the calls and do whatever she had to do. And I stepped in and told her assistant and tried to help with the class. All wasn't well, but he was fine. And as dramatic as it might be to say that his life was saved, I believe she learned that he wasn't even at the White House that day, and that he was never really in any danger. This went on too long. Maybe I'll re-record it, but my impulse there was to go see my son. My impulse on that day was to go find my family. And I'm reading personal letters and value statements that my students are writing in this difficult time. And so many of them are writing about this new appreciation that they have for this family. And while it would be nice to say, boy, wouldn't it be nice if we had that kind of appreciation all the time, and not only when there was some sort of tragedy or catastrophe, but I think that's unrealistic. The beauty of family is that we can take them for granted and they will still be there. And then in difficult times, we have them. So I encourage you to look to your family, to maintain those relationships or to build those relationships if they're broken, because that's where I went, and that's where so many of us are going now, and we should stay there, even when this current problem, as all problems do, fades a bit into the past and is something that we have to work to remember and to teach the next generation, as we're doing now. Thank you, Dr. Lisambe, for this project. Don't use this one if it's as embarrassing as it feels like it was. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Academy.
And so the question is, where were you on September 11th, 2001? I was in this room. I was getting ready to teach my classes, and someone came up the stairs and said that the United States was under attack, that two planes had hit the Twin Towers in New York City, and no one knew what was going to happen next. And the school became very quiet. The students had been on the phones with their parents. They were calling, and the children and the students started to leave the school. And those of us who had children here or who were willing to stay, stayed to comfort those who were waiting and to support our own kids and to support each other. About a month after, or maybe a little longer, after 9/11, 2001, the school had an assembly to honor those who had passed and to share some remarks and to reflect upon the enormity of the actions taken on that day. And my friend Doris Cordes spoke, and at that time she said and recounted a story about a gentleman who was handicapped, who could not leave one of the towers, and the fact that one of his friends stayed with him until the end. And so the two friends ended their lives together. And to this day, I am moved by that story. Tomorrow would have been service day in the upper school. And because of COVID, we won't be going. Transportation is just impossible. But I am heartened by the way that many of us have, and many of you have supported one another during this difficulty and found ways to share good deeds and kindness throughout all of this. And so, like the picture behind me of Aeneas carrying his handicapped father out of Troy that has just been wiped out, I am heartened by the fact that people still do good things, that we have it in us. And I am looking forward to Service Day 2, the best day of the year, at some future date. I leave you with that.
Hi, everyone. On September 11th, 2001, I was in my second year of teaching history at Columbus Academy. I remember I was teaching in a room off of the senior lobby there in the first floor, and Mr. Warren, who was then the dean of students, stuck his head in the door and said, my wife said, we should really turn on the television and see what's going on. So we did that, and we're sort of in disbelief as we saw the second plane hit the second tower in New York City. And of course, he spent the rest of the day trying to figure out what it all means, trying to care for the kids who were at school and their families. There are families that came and signed their kids out. I know there are a lot of families worried about friends and family who either lived or worked in New York City or DC or other places, or maybe were in the military. And it was just an odd and very difficult day. The other thing I remember was that night going home, how quiet everything was. There was not the usual air traffic you'd see going in and out of Columbus Airport. And then the last thing that I remember was the next day, I think it was the next night, it might have been 2 nights later, we had back to school night in the upper school. And the school set up a TV on one of those big old carts in the senior quad, and teachers and parents sort of gathered around when they could and watched President Bush give his address to the nation. And, at that time, there was a lot of goodwill and support and grace being offered from various parts of the globe, all around the globe, really, in support of the United States. And I think that's something we can latch onto in difficult times. And of course, much of that goodwill sort of dissipated as the U.S. got involved in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places where we're still involved. But that sort of goodwill and outpouring of support from humanity, I think, was reassuring to a lot of folks, and just was a reminder, of course, that we are all in this together. And I think that's something to hold on to when times are difficult. Thank you.
On 9/11, I was living in Portland, Oregon with my husband. We were both teaching at a school in Portland, Oregon. So we woke up, somebody phoned the house and told us that what had happened. Of course, we were 3 hours earlier, so we woke up to find the news had already occurred. We immediately, of course, turned on the television, watched the footage, and then had to get dressed to go to school. I remember going to school that day. It was early in my teaching career. I was teaching 10th grade chemistry, thinking, how on earth can I talk about this with my 10th graders? I didn't know them well at that point. It was just a week into the school year. I did not feel equipped as a teacher to deal with something of this magnitude. But we got through the day with love and open hearts and caring for one another. And I think now when I reflect on 9/11, what I think most about are people all over this world who are suffering from violence. And I hope that our understanding of what happened to us as a country in 9/11 helps us think about everyone who's suffering with great compassion and think about how we can help those people.
Good morning, Vikings. This is Mr. Alexio. I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about 9/11. I listened to many of my colleagues talk about it on their videos, and it's a powerful reminder of that day. I was in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. I was in Army school at the time, training to be an Army staff officer, and I remember what a couple folks have said in their videos. I remember the skies. I remember the skies being empty that day. After hearing it in the morning, we were supposed to go off post to an exercise, and ended up staying on post that day. So that it felt different. It was a gorgeous day in Kansas. And so that's the first thing I remember. I also remember just the many, many images from that day that you continue to see. Images of buildings, images of people in the building, images of firefighters covered in soot and ash, and just folks walking and running. And, images are powerful, particularly for some reason, photographs, for me, even more so than videos. So those images stick with me. I remember the people in those images. The people in the planes, the people in the buildings, some people I knew at the Pentagon that I had worked with who died that day when Flight 77 hit the Pentagon. And then I also think about the confusion and the uncertainty that I feel has gone forward from that day. When we deal with situations like that and think of how to respond. And the changes that we continue to see, whether it's when you go to the airport, how things are different, or the way people view the world and travel and other things. The implications of that day for me changed considerably. I spent a year in Iraq, lost a good friend in Iraq, doing what we were trained to do, what our military was asked to do. But as quite a few other people have talked about, for me, the people of that day and the network of connections for people, friends, family members who were in New York or in Pennsylvania or in the Pentagon, or know people who were the first responders who worked tirelessly for months. I've been fortunate to go to each of the memorials at the Pentagon, in Shanksville, and in Manhattan. And they're powerful reminders of that day. And I would encourage all of you, if you get a chance, to go and reflect. There are many positive things that come out of that tragedy. Seeing people band together to support one another in crisis. I know that's happened before 9/11, and it continues to happen as we go through our own crisis here in our country right now. With COVID-19, but I choose to remember that. I choose to remember the good things in my friends and colleagues that passed, and I appreciate the opportunity to think about it and work in an environment where others reflect on the goodness in people, even in light of tragedy. So, thank you for the chance to share.
Hi, I'm Dr. Bundy, and I wanted to share with you some of my memories and recollections of 9/11. So at the time, I was a sophomore in college, and I was studying abroad in Innsbruck, Austria. It was a program through my college, and I was there with a group of other kids from my school. And we were taking German classes and culture classes and economic, all different courses. We were at the time actually in Salzburg. We were spending the first couple of weeks of our time there in Salzburg, and we had arrived in mid-August. And so by September 11th, we'd been there for a couple of weeks, and we were in the middle of an intensive course in German. Our assignment that day, obviously Europe is 6 hours ahead of the US, and our assignment that day was to go off in pairs, and we were exploring the city. We were doing like some kind of scavenger hunt type of thing, I think, and my friend Graham and I went off and were doing our assignment, and later in the afternoon we decided to stop at an internet cafe, because that was mainly how we got our email and had our information from back home. And we stopped at an internet cafe, and as we walked in, there were TVs up, and everybody was just looking at the TVs. And you could see one of the towers had already been hit. And we looked at each other. We didn't really know what to think of it. And we stood there watching with the other people that were in the cafe, and then that's when the other plane hit the second tower. And at that moment, we knew that this wasn't an accident, that it wasn't a coincidence or something. It was a targeted attack of some kind from who we didn't know. But it was really scary to be elsewhere in that moment, to not be in the United States. It wasn't the first time I'd been abroad, but it was the first time I'd been abroad for an extended period. And so in the moment, I felt really scared. And then I started to feel a lot more scared for my family and friends back home. I actually realized that I was possibly more protected where I was than some of my loved ones at home, and started to try to get in touch with all of them. One of the other clear memories I have is the outpouring of support that I felt, and we felt, the American students that were studying together from our friends and host families and professors in Austria. I remember coming in, and our favorite teacher, her name was Imi. She was just sobbing. She was so upset and hugged all of us, and it felt really like this wasn't just an attack on the United States, but on humanity. And that really meant a lot to me and to the others that I was with at the time. A few months later, as the invasion of Afghanistan was launched, and there were some significant changes, we started to be, the students that I was with, we were often asked about our government's policies regarding the Middle East and regarding Afghanistan. And I would say that was a moment. I'd always been interested in history and government, but that was one of the moments where I really started to pay more attention so that I could understand the context for some of our policies and what was happening, so that I could, when asked in social situations, I had something to say and I could give some sort of response to what was to why the United States was doing certain things at the time. So yeah, that's what I would remember. And as I've watched some of the other videos, as some of the other teachers and faculty members have said, I really it's something I'll never forget.
Good morning. I remember as clear as day the events of September 11th, 2001. I was living and working in downtown Boston, and at the time I was doing technology consulting, and I had a client coming in to meet with me and some other analysts, and my colleague, one of the other analysts, was nowhere to be found, and it was incredibly unlikely he was always on time, so I was confused as to his whereabouts. And on my way to try and find him, I had another colleague grab me and was saying that a plane just ran into the World Trade Center, and we were immediately trying to figure out exactly what was going on. I went down to find my clients and explained to them that we were trying to discern what was happening in Manhattan. And finally, when I found my colleague who was missing, his father was working in and around the World Trade Center, and the sheer panic and confusion was absolutely palpable, and I still feel it today. The company that I worked for shut down everything, as did almost the entire city of Boston, given the fact that the flights had left from there. And I can remember being so angry at my customers and my clients because they didn't understand and were unwilling to leave. They said, well, we've got this appointment, we want to keep it going. And I just remember this feeling of anguish and emotion with their not understanding the gravity of what had happened. And then to top everything off, I went home, and I was living in a brownstone, and we had been scheduled to have DirecTV installed on the roof, and the person who was doing the install came by, and so we were up on the roof, and there was no one on the streets, and there were fighter planes circling the city of Boston. It was just, it was just a very, very strange, surreal experience to be in that city, and the number of people who were touched with the connections between Boston and New York was unbelievable. People who were supposed to fly that didn't, and people who were there in New York. Scary stuff. A moment that certainly I will not forget.
I was starting my junior year at Ohio State that fall. It was about a week before classes actually started for fall quarter that year. But I was on campus because I had a job at the Ohio State Student Pharmacy, which was housed in the same building that the student clinic was also in. And that morning I got into work at about 7:30, and in the area in which I was working, there was no TV or radio or anything like that, but we kind of shared a lobby, well, kind of out in the hallway, we shared a lobby with the student clinic. And right about around 8 o'clock, when the first planes hit, a bunch of the nurses from the clinic had kind of filtered out into the lobby to see what was happening on the TV. And that was when we got news of the first plane hitting. And at that point, I think nobody knew what was actually happening. My initial reaction was it was an accident, right? That there's no way that anybody could intentionally fly a plane into a building. So that was my initial reaction, was a horrible, horrible accident. My brother and dad were actually meant to fly out that morning from Columbus to Atlanta. And I knew they were flying that day, but I didn't know what time. So the next thing I did was call my mom to make sure that they weren't getting on a plane. But shortly thereafter, pretty quickly, the second plane hit. And I think at that point, everybody knew that this is not an accident.
On 9/11/2001, I was stationed in Newport, Rhode Island at the Naval Station, where I was on the faculty at Naval Justice School. And I remember just having been in the midst of an exercise with some new JAGs. I was leading this exercise, and we took a little break, and I stepped out into the passageway, and a Marine Corps colleague of mine, came up and told me that a plane had just flown into one of the Twin Towers, and mentioned that the news was covering it and suggested coming down to the lounge that we had there in the schoolhouse. So I went down to the lounge to watch, and that's where I began to watch all the events of that horrible day play out. Obviously, that day was a game changer for all of us. For me, as a new dad, our daughter Grace was just over a year old. It made me reflect on where we stood in the world and what was going on around us. Locally, it definitely affected life at the Naval Station. We had to consider the fact that the island that the Naval Station was located on, Aquidneck Island, where Newport and Portsmouth and Middletown, Rhode Island are, the Naval Station is in Newport. It was connected to the mainland by one big bridge, and that bridge could easily be a target. What might that mean? It was sort of a soft target in the view that a lot of us had. So was that a risk factor? That was something we had to think about. We thought about access to the Naval Station and what we were doing with security, and from that point forward, base security and access to the base really tightened up. We even had to think about things like when it was appropriate or even safe to wear a uniform. And we were given guidance on not wearing a uniform on the commute to and from the base, not wearing a uniform out in town, certainly thinking twice about when we were a uniform out in public, not to wear a uniform in an airport, just because we didn't know who or where the risk factors might lie. It was also a game changer just in terms of the global scope of things as we embarked on what became known at that time as the global war on terror. And the truth is that it didn't necessarily need to be a game changer in the sense that it was not the first terror attack on America. It wasn't even the first terror attack on the World Trade Center. But the scope and the horror, the scale of this one was different, and it got everybody's attention, and it put us on this new path where we were newly focused on dealing with transnational terror. So that's my story. Thanks for listening.
Hi, everyone. I just want to talk to you a little about what my memories are of September 11th. And I think it's interesting that you can ask anybody where they were that day and what they were doing, and they will be able to tell you exactly to the minute what they were doing and when what they were doing at certain times of the day. I liken it to Pearl Harbor for my grandfather. I was in Boston. I had just moved there in the spring. Oh, actually, I had graduated in the spring, and then I had moved literally 2 weeks prior to the bombing, September 11th. So I arrived early September to Boston, and had rented a little apartment. And I turned on TV that morning, and naively thought I was watching an action movie. That's how your brain just kind of tries to make sense of what you're seeing. And so I turned to the next channel and I was like, I don't want to watch that. And I turned to the next channel and it was on again and again and again. And that's when I realized it was more than just a movie, that it was actually happening. It was a long day. People were quiet. The airs were quiet. I don't remember hearing any music. TVs were the only thing I heard, the news, and that video being replayed again and again and again. Now, being in Boston, Bostonians really don't have a lot of love for New Yorkers. I think it's the Red Sox and the Yankees, that conflict that they have, that competition they have between the two, that makes them not really enjoy each other's company very much. But I remember the Bostonians that I were around, the bloodlines were out the door and down the street and around the corners, people waiting for hours to give blood. I remember the helpers, people just really wanting to give their time and their energy and coming around and trying to make it better. I remember the telephone workers trying to get the lines going again, because there was no lines that day. You couldn't talk to anybody. There was no email. There was no texting. There was no phone calls, landlines. They were all down. And I remember people coming out of the woodwork to help out with that. So I think that's what we need to remember in times that are tough. Look for the helpers.
So as most of y'all know, I'm a pretty early riser, and I had to get up early in the morning. I was in an undergrad at the University of Houston, and I woke up really early and walked outside, and the news was just on. I guess my mom had put the news on, and I was on my way to get ready to go to Miss Baker's poetry class, like the things that you remember and the way that it cements and solidifies, that morning. And I looked up at the TV screen, not to make light of it. I thought an old rerun of the movie Die Hard was playing. For those of you that have seen Die Hard, I mean, there's this building that's got smoke coming out of it and just this fire. And I was still groggy. I'd just woken up, thought to myself, wait, well, this is a really weird time for Die Hard to be playing. And then it hit me that it was occurring while it was going on. And when I told my mother what was going down, I came back out. And at that point, the second plane came in and toppled it. And I pretty much saw that in real time. And it's just one of these things that I don't think there's a place in your brain that can process that. So I drove to school listening to talk radio to see if I could get any information. And I remember going into Miss Baker's class and Miss Baker saying, I can't do this today. Everybody just go home and be with your families, try to be safe. And then within 15 to 20 minutes, we got the email that the University of Houston had closed down its campus. And it was insane. As a matter of fact, I had a small addiction to talk radio for a really, really long time, because I spent the literal weeks and months after the September 11th attacks wondering what was going to happen next, what was going to be the United States' answer. And so, and I think the image that has stayed with me the longest is watching the people that jumped out of, the building and just thinking to myself at that moment in time, whether you have to choose between whether you want to die burning to death or whether you want to die jumping out of a 42nd story window, and just feeling crushed by the idea that somebody would have to make that choice.
Hi everyone, I'm Miss Eden. I'm going to share a little bit about my recollection of what happened on 9/11. So I was in college at the University of Iowa, living in Iowa City, and I was working as a bartender to pay my way through school. And so I'd worked the night before it happened. I actually think it might have been Monday Night Football. And so I worked very late. The bar closed at 2:30, and then we had to stay and clean. And so that would have meant I would get home maybe around 3:30 in the morning. And so I, had just gone to bed at about maybe 4. And then shortly after that, my roommate busted into my room to tell me to wake up and come downstairs because a plane had hit the World Trade Center. And I have to tell you, I was pretty enveloped in my college life at the time. And so at first I was sort of like, I don't know if I care. What's the World Trade Center? And I kind of got my bearings and thought about it. And I was like, I really dislike my roommates that live downstairs. And for him to bust into my room and wake me up for this news, this must be really significant. So I managed to kind of gather myself and go downstairs. And unfortunately, the timing was such that I saw the second plane hit the tower in real time. And the news reporters that were on air at the time react in real time, which was pretty traumatic, I have to tell you. And from there, what I remember is kind of like every couple minutes, it felt like one more terrible thing was happening that I was seeing on the screen. And, everybody was silent. And in the days that followed, it felt like a ghost town. And even the people that were out and about kind of doing what they had to do, it was sort of like zombies. Nobody could really find the words to articulate what had happened and to fill the space, that was really occupied by a lot of fear and worry. In addition, my parents both living in Alaska. My father worked at the airport at the time. There was a plane that was grounded immediately following the events, and it was really scary because there was some worry about that particular flight. My mom also worked for the Alyeska Pipeline, which is the Trans-Alaska oil pipeline. It's considered, I think, a pretty sensitive target, and they had all kinds of like lockdown protocols and security protocols that were happening, and it was hard for me to reach my parents, and they were very scared, and I can't imagine what it must have been like for family members of people that were in the area, in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, or at the Pentagon, or by the Twin Towers. So I think in reflecting on all of that and how we emerged from such a horrific national trauma, for me personally, I was 21 years old. It was a time in my life when I was kind of on the cusp of being a young person, a senior in college, but also an adult. I had my own job and starting to think about my future. And I think it really solidified a lot of my personal values, my political values, and also what it meant to be a community. I don't just mean like my particular little city of Iowa City at the time or my friend group. I think, we really were searching desperately for things that bound us together, and gave people comfort in community, and that was a beautiful thing, really, that came out of that. And I can't help but think that the same is true for our current global crisis, this pandemic. I hope and I believe that in reflecting on this crazy time, you'll find that there was a silver lining in terms of the relationships that you've built, and the way that it's brought your various communities, your various orbits together.
I do remember where I was September 11th very, very well. I was at Columbus Academy. It was starting my third year. It was a gorgeous day. And I was in my office just listening to messages, figuring out what I was going to do. And my husband called and told me that we'd been attacked and that something happened to the world. The World Trade Centers had been hit, and I couldn't believe it. I left my office right away and went out into the hallways, and people started coming out of their classrooms. And I immediately went down. I heard that they were showing coverage in the theater, and I went down and listened in the theater a little while and watched it play out in real time. And then quickly we gathered with the admin team at the time. And that's when I heard there was a third plane. The third plane was missing, and it was flying somewhere. Yeah, they weren't sure where, but they thought it was heading for DC. I have a lot of family in DC and Baltimore, so I had this really, really panic feeling like, all of a sudden it was not abstract, it was real, and worried about my family. And then realizing that I had to really get it together, since I was going to be providing support that day for everybody else being worried. So, and then I do remember somebody coming in and telling us the towers had fallen and just how devastating that was. And it was a really, really, really scary time. Kids were crying. A lot of kids had families in New York. Kids were really upset. Of course, I was in the middle school then. We weren't letting them watch all day. But it was really very scary day. At the end of the day, I left. I picked up my 2 really little kids then. We looked at the sky, how blue it was, and how there were no planes in the sky, and how weird that was. But what we did see is people coming together after that, with a great love and appreciation for our country, helping out each other, and that we saw in the days and weeks to come. We got through that time, as terrible as it was, and it tells me that we are stronger as a nation than we think we are. We are stronger as a people than we think we are. We have a great capacity for love and empathy and understanding. So, that being through that time, defined many of us, and continues to this day. But it has shaped us to know that tough times come and tough times go, and we will get through them.
Hello, everyone. On September 11th, I was at Kenyon College in Gambier, Ohio. I was working in the admissions office, and I was planning a visit day for students, an admissions open house. And I remember it being a crystal clear day, and then someone coming and sharing the news that one of the Twin Towers had just been hit. And I remember just the grief and sadness, the disbelief at the loss of life, and the hatred that must have sprung forward for something like this to have happened. I had 2 people who I went to high school with who worked in the Twin Towers, and they were brothers, and they both lost their life that day. Hoping that everyone in the world can think about all the lessons that we know about being a friend to someone and take that on a global scale. Because I think if we think of all of our relationships with others the way that we think of the relationships with our friends, then the world would be a more peaceful place. Hugs to all.
So on September 11th, 2001, I was actually a freshman in undergrad, and I grew up here in Ohio, in Newark, but I went to college in New Jersey at Princeton, and Princeton and a lot of East Coast schools don't start their college experiences until about mid-September. And as a freshman, I moved on campus the weekend before September 11th, which I believe was a Tuesday. And so I had been on campus for 2.5 days. And I remember being awakened by one of my roommates, and these were all roommates who had been assigned to me randomly. Well, not quite randomly. So I didn't know them. So I had met them 2 days prior, and they were essentially strangers at that point. And I remember thinking, what kind of strange roommate wakes up another roommate on a random morning? But then she said to me, something's happening. I think you're going to want to watch this. And so I went into the common room with my other roommates, and there were 4 of us total. And we had one of those teeny tiny little box TVs that was just like nestled into the non-functioning fireplace that was in our common room. And we were all huddled around on our little futon we just purchased, watching. And the first plane had already hit. And at that point, we really didn't know. At first, they thought it was an accident, right? And so it was this kind of tragic, strange accident that had occurred. But then as I was watching with my roommates, the second plane hit. And that is when I just remember this kind of collective intaking of breath in the room, where we all realized this is not an accident. This is orchestrated. And I remember thinking to myself a couple different things in that moment. One, oh my gosh, this is terrifying. And 2, I really wish I were back in the cornfields of Ohio right now. New Jersey is very close to New York City. In fact, later in the week, from a different spot in the state, we were able to see some of the kind of dust rising up from the World Trade Center rubble. But I just thought to myself, oh my goodness, I would not be in nearly as much danger if I were in the cornfields right now, and I'm on the East Coast and in a brand new place, my first time living away from home, with these people that I didn't even really know, this place that I certainly wasn't familiar with, and now this was happening. And I remember I actually had to go to it was kind of still orientation type things, and so I had to go to like a creative writing orientation session, so I had to leave my room after knowing that this second plane had hit and go listen about the logistics of classes. And I remember when I came back, there was someone in my dorm building that was playing the song Imagine on loop over and over again, loudly with their window open, and that struck an emotional chord with me. And another thing that was really scary about that time is that, especially on the East Coast, though I imagine this probably happened elsewhere in the country, even that places that weren't as close to New York City as I was, is that the phone lines didn't work. That was true for cell phones. Cell phones, you couldn't get reception because there was so much traffic being taxed on the cell towers, but also our landline phone in our dorm room didn't work because there was so much activity on those as well. And so what I remember really I wanted to do was talk to my mom, and I couldn't because the phone wasn't working. And at that point, we really didn't know what was happening. We didn't know if it was over. And at that point, it wasn't. There were other planes in the air. We didn't know who was doing it necessarily. We didn't know if all of us were vulnerable for imminent attack. And so really, I wanted to get in touch with my mom. And I remember being on AOL Instant Messenger, and this friend of mine from high school who lived in the Ohio area, still lived in Columbus, he reached out to me and asked how I was doing, and I expressed to him that I really wish that I could get a hold of my mom. And he said, well, would you like me to call her for you? Our phone lines are working. And so I gave him her work number, because she was teaching at the time, and he was able to touch base with her and let her know that we were okay in New Jersey, and he let me know that she was fine in Ohio, but that her brother, my uncle, was working in the city and they hadn't yet heard from him. And so then that added that other layer of fear that kind of sat with me all day, because we didn't find out that he was all right until later in the day. And I just remember this feeling of disbelief, this feeling of fear, of confusion, of not knowing what was happening, not knowing what was going to happen, and really feeling like the rug had been taken out from under me in a lot of ways, especially since I was starting a brand new life with brand new people in a brand new place. So there was absolutely no familiarity, and that was frightening. But I do think it helped me bond with people, as those sorts of events do. And being a freshman on a campus where we were all experiencing this really scary thing, and of course there were some students who did lose loved ones. Luckily my uncle was okay, but that wasn't true for everybody's loved ones. And so going through that experience together, I think bonded us as a group of students, as a campus, more than I would have felt bonded to them had this not occurred. And I remember coming together the next day, and Toni Morrison was a professor at the time at Princeton, and she gave this beautiful, beautiful address that made so many people cry. And it was filled with sadness, but also with hope and with unity and with belief in the fundamental good of people and our strength. And I remember thinking to myself, this is such an important and poignant moment, and I'm a part of a community that's experiencing it.
September 11th, I was teaching at Highland Local Schools, which was my first teaching job, and I had 7th grade music. And my principal came to my classroom. He went around to everyone's classroom, and he told me what had happened before he told the students. He gave me a moment to kind of step into the hallway and digest what had been said. And then he talked to my class. He told them what had happened, and he fielded all sorts of questions and was very honest with the students. And I think I will always remember the honesty in which he delivered this tragic news. And after we found out what happened, my first instinct was to contact my sister, who lived in New York at the time. I couldn't get through to her. None of the phone lines would work. A couple hours later, I finally got in touch with my mom, who was away from her desk, and I talked to her coworker, who said, "We've talked to your sister. Your mom talked to your sister. She's fine." And the rest of the day was pushing TVs from the library out into the hallways so students could watch news coverage and teachers could watch news coverage if they wanted to. It was talking to students. It was just giving everyone kind of space to process and try to understand, even though there wasn't really any understanding that happened that day. I guess if I can offer a message of hope, there was a profound sense of unity around that event. We as a country experienced that together. It was something that everyone remembers who was alive on that day. And it unified us as communities, and I think people came together to help more in response to that event. So look for the helpers.
So I remember September 11th, 2001, I was teaching my second year, 6th grade band, and we had TVs in the classroom. And my principal, who was always telling jokes that really didn't ever land, said, "Come, you gotta turn on your TV with the kids in the room. Plane just hit the World Trade Center." And I thought, because his jokes were usually off color, that this was a joke. And I turned on the TV and it wasn't. And I remember looking at my students, who, again, are like 12 years old, 11, 12 years old. And they were terrified. They were legitimately terrified. Fast forward to the end of the day, we usually had marching band practice after school, and we didn't have anything. Most kids had gone home by that time. And I remember walking outside to my car, and the thing I remember the most is the quiet. The skies were always filled with airplanes. Being in West Jefferson, it was a flight path for Columbus Airport, and it was just silent. There was nothing. You couldn't hear trains. You couldn't hear planes. Again, most people were home watching their televisions. So I do remember a couple days later, and this is something that will always stick with me, my band seniors came to me and said, "Mrs. Sneeringer, we need to make sure we honor those who died." And we ended up having the football game that Friday night against Jonathan Alder. And our two bands came together and played a couple of patriotic songs. We didn't march, we just made music. And having the two bands play that kind of thing with a patriotic sense in mind, and seeing everybody come together like that on such a short-term notice and with such heavy emotion happening was something I'll never forget. I was really proud of those seniors, and a lot of them have gone on to become educators, actually, and they kind of cite that day as something that changed their future paths. So coming together was kind of the thing, right? I wish we would do that more often now.